I was digging through an old box of photographs I found in my late grandfather's attic when I stumbled upon something utterly bizarre. At first glance, they looked like postcards from the 1800s. Grand, sweeping views of London, Manchester, and even a few shots of Edinburgh. The streets were immaculate, the architecture flawless, and everything appeared to be captured at the peak of Victorian grandeur. But, and here's the kicker, there wasn't a single soul in any of these pictures. Not a passerby, not a street vendor, no horse-drawn carriages, not even a stray dog. Just empty streets and silent squares, frozen in time. At first I thought maybe it was just the limitations of early photography. You know, the long exposure times meant that any moving object would blur or vanish altogether. That's what the history books say, right? But then I started looking closer. Markets were deserted. The stalls had no goods, no barrels, no crates, nothing. And the carriage stands completely bare. No horses tied up, no carts waiting for passengers. It was as if someone had wiped out every trace of life. Now here's where it gets even weirder. The windows. You'd expect to see curtains fluttering in the breeze or flower pots on the sills. But nope. The windows were as bare as a skull's eye sockets. No curtains, no sign of life behind the glass. Even the balconies, which are usually cluttered with drying laundry or a chair or two, were spotless. Like the entire city was prepped for a photo shoot and someone forgot to call the extras. Then I looked up to the rooftops dotted with chimneys. In a city like London, every chimney should be puffing away, signaling warm fires inside. But not a wisp of smoke. The air was as clear as a cloudless day in June. Cooking fires out, heating fires cold. It was impossible to imagine an entire city, or several of them, completely extinguished like that all at once. I swear I half expected to hear the eerie echo of my own footsteps in those empty streets. But there was one photo, just one, that showed a faint, ghostly wisp of smoke curling up from a chimney. So faint, I thought it was a scratch on the glass. But if it was real, it was like the dying flicker of a candle in an endless dark room. The whole thing felt like a massive stage scene. And that's when I realized these weren't just snapshots, they were official records. The streets were spotless, the buildings freshly repaired, the fountains in Hyde Park running full blast, but with no one around to admire them. It was as if someone was preparing these cities for something, or someone. And what could have emptied out entire cities like this? The official story points to the year without a summer in 1816, thanks to a volcanic eruption that plunged the northern hemisphere into darkness and cold. But the evidence I found hinted at something much darker, something more permanent. I'm starting to think that what we're looking at isn't just a photographic oddity, but a chilling record of a civilization caught in the grip of a disaster so vast it erased entire populations, leaving behind only these ghostly empty monuments. And as I stared at those photos, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in those silent streets, just beyond the empty windows, a secret was waiting to be uncovered. Something no one was meant to see. But what was it? And who or what was left behind? The more I stared at those eerie photographs, the more I felt like I was stepping into a ghost story written in stone and glass. So I decided to dig deeper, starting with the people who might have taken these strange pictures. Their names were long gone, but the style of photography screamed official, almost bureaucratic. No artistic flair, just cold, clinical documentation. It was like some government inspector's report frozen in time. I imagined the photographer as a stiff-collared, no-nonsense bloke named Arthur Hargreaves, lugging around a bulky camera on a tripod, trudging through the empty streets of London or Manchester in his polished boots, probably muttering about the cold and the lack of decent tea. No one about, he'd grumble, not even a bloody cat. And yet his duty was clear: capture the city, every spotless street, every empty fountain, every silent square, without a soul in sight. One image caught my eye in particular: a narrow street in York, glistening wet from a recent rain, the cobblestones shining under a dull gray sky. At the far end, a single window was cracked open, just a sliver, enough to let in a breath of stale air. I couldn't help but picture the occupant inside. A woman, perhaps. Maybe someone like Eleanor, a sharp-eyed school teacher who refused to flee like the rest. I imagined her slender fingers clutching an old brass key, her dark hair pinned neatly beneath a modest bonnet. Her wool dress was simple but well-pressed, and her boots, though sturdy, carried a hint of elegance, a reminder that even in despair, dignity remains. Why would she stay behind when everyone else vanished? Was she trapped? Or waiting for something? Maybe she was the last spark of life in a city gone cold. Then there were the fountains in Hyde Park, the ones that should have been the heartbeats of a lively city. But instead they gushed water in eerie silence. No children laughing nearby, no couples stealing a moment on the benches. I imagined the engineers responsible for maintaining the waterworks, perhaps a gruff man named George, standing alone in rain-soaked trousers, watching the machines roar to life for no one. Bloody pointless, he'd mutter, wiping mud from his hands. Running water for ghosts. It was surreal, like a stage set for a play where the actors forgot their lines and never showed up. What struck me next was the utter absence of life's little clutter. No firewood stacked by doorways, no coal sacks waiting to be unloaded, no barrels or crates marking commerce. It was as if someone had meticulously cleaned away every sign of daily existence, wiping the slate clean. And yet, despite the cold, sterile perfection, these cities weren't ruins. They weren't crumbling into dust or covered in vines. They gleamed as if polished for an important occasion that was never to come. I kept returning to that one faint wisp of smoke in the distance. It was like a secret message whispered through a veil of silence. Was someone still alive? Or was it the ghost of a city refusing to die? Whatever it was, the more I looked, the more I realized this was a story about disappearance on a scale so vast it defied logic. An entire world paused mid-breath, caught between devastation and rebirth. And somewhere buried beneath the snow and silence, I was convinced the truth was waiting, hidden in plain sight, just beyond that cracked window. But what exactly had happened to Eleanor, to George, and to the millions who once breathed life into these empty streets? And what role did I, a mere observer from the future, play in uncovering their forgotten story? The deeper I dug, the more I realized that uncovering the story behind these empty cities was like trying to solve a puzzle where half the pieces had been deliberately hidden or destroyed. I decided to track down any surviving records from that strange period, hoping to find some clue beyond the haunting photographs. What I found was frustratingly sparse. Official archives from the era were either missing or heavily redacted. It was as if someone had taken a giant eraser to history itself. Newspapers from the time barely mentioned anything unusual, just the usual reports of chilly summers and bad harvests. But hidden in the margins of old journals and personal letters, I found whispers of something far darker. One letter, penned by a man named Thomas Whitaker, a merchant from Bristol, described a great frost that never left, and streets emptied by an unseen shadow. And another diary entry, from a nurse named Margaret Collins in Leeds, spoke of a hunger that made people cruel, and roads that disappeared under relentless snow. The tone was desperate, almost frantic, but these accounts were rare, scattered like shards of glass in a vast desert. I tried to imagine Margaret, wearing her worn but clean apron, her hair pinned back tightly, her eyes hollow from sleepless nights, tending to the sick in freezing wards, while outside the world fell silent. Her hands might have trembled as she wrote those words by candlelight, hoping someone someday would remember what had caused such a freeze. Scientists today blame the eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815 for the year without a summer. But these personal accounts suggested a much longer, harsher winter, 3 years of relentless cold that brought famine and death. I pictured the countryside, once fertile and green, now buried under thick layers of snow and ice. Fields lay fallow, crops failed, and the horses, once the lifeblood of transportation, grew weak and were eventually slaughtered for food. It was a grim calculus. Feed the animals or feed the people. The animals lost. Without horses, the cities were cut off. Roads became impassable. Rivers froze solid. The great arteries of commerce and communication were severed. Letters took months to arrive if they arrived at all. Supplies dwindled. Panic set in. It reminded me of trying to commute during a London tube strike. Only nobody could just hop on a bus or call an Uber. Imagine being stuck in a city where every delivery was a death-defying expedition through blizzards and collapsing infrastructure. The weight of isolation pressing down like the snow piled high on every doorstep. I found accounts of desperate attempts to send couriers south for grain, only for them to vanish in the wilderness. Some never returned. Others came back with empty hands and haunted eyes. The empire was unraveling, not with the clash of swords or the roar of cannons, but under the silent siege of ice and hunger. And then, the darkness within the cities themselves. As food ran out, societal norms crumbled. Margaret's diary hinted at an unimaginable descent into savagery. Rats hunted as food, pets disappearing, and the chilling implication of cannibalism whispered in hushed tones. I shuddered imagining the catacombs beneath London, once a place of reverent rest, now a grim graveyard marked by the teeth marks on bones. Silent testimony to the worst horrors of famine. Yet amidst the despair, some fled to the forests, the last refuge. The wild once feared became salvation. People traded city comforts for the brutal fight to survive among the trees, hunting what little game remained, gathering firewood to stave off the cold. I pictured Eleanor again, perhaps one of those who stayed behind, or maybe one who escaped into the woods. Her dress torn but her spirit unbroken, her boots muddied but steady. Was she a survivor or a ghost? And so the cities remained frozen in time, empty, spotless, and waiting. Waiting for the sun to return, for life to rekindle, for the impossible to become possible again. But when the warmth finally came, it wasn't a savior. It was a new curse. Thawed bodies began to decay, wells turned to poison, and disease spread like wildfire. The cities became tombs, too dangerous to enter, ruled now by feral animals and death. The silence in those photographs wasn't peace. It was the aftermath of a nightmare. And somewhere in this ruin, a question gnawed at me. Who decided to wipe this story from memory? Who ordered the erasure of the past so completely that even the streets forgot their people? The truth was buried beneath layers of snow, smoke, and silence. And as I held those fragile photographs, I knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. I kept turning that question over in my mind while sifting through dusty archives and peeling old maps in the dim light of my study. Who wiped the past clean, and why? The more I read, the more I realized that the silence wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. A massive cover-up cloaked in layers of forgotten paper and faded ink. One of the few surviving official reports I found was a dry government document from the Home Office, dated a few years after the catastrophe. It spoke in cold, bureaucratic language about urban resettlement programs and population redistribution, as if people were nothing more than chess pieces moved around a board. The report praised the successful restoration of infrastructure, but made no mention of the millions who vanished or the horrors that unfolded. I imagined the men in dark suits and top hats sitting around a polished mahogany table in Whitehall, sipping bitter tea, discussing how best to erase a nightmare from the national memory. Gentlemen, one might have said, we cannot afford to dwell on the past. The public must believe in progress, in renewal. Let us rewrite the story. And so history was rewritten. The icy years became a mere footnote. The famine and collapse were glossed over with tales of pioneering spirit and triumphant rebuilding. The dead were buried beneath layers of convenient silence. But the photographs remained, those haunting images untouched by time, stubborn witnesses to what had been lost. I found myself haunted by the faces of those who once walked those empty streets. Eleanor with her sharp eyes and quiet courage. Margaret, the weary nurse fighting disease and despair. And Thomas, the merchant caught in a world unraveling faster than he could count his losses. One afternoon, while examining a photograph of a deserted street in Bath, I noticed something I hadn't before. A faint shadow flickering in a second-story window. It was subtle, just a dark blur against the glass, but unmistakably human-shaped. A flicker of movement in a city frozen in time. Who was this shadow? A lone survivor, a restless spirit, or a trap for the unwary? That single detail shattered the illusion of total emptiness. It suggested there were still secrets lurking behind those blank facades. Driven by a mix of curiosity and dread, I decided to follow the trail of these images. If the cities had been emptied, who had returned first? Who dared to cross the threshold back into these ghost towns? I started to piece together stories of small groups who sneak back into the ruins, scavengers, watchmen, or perhaps those too stubborn or broken to leave. Some risked disease, others the wild animals that now prowled the streets. I pictured a man like George, the water engineer, standing alone by a fountain, the rain soaking into his threadbare coat. The hum of machinery, the only sound in a city that had forgotten how to live. And then there were the children, orphans who emerged from the woods, their eyes wide and empty, carrying no memory of what life had been before. They were the blank slate, the lost generation, the Ivans without kinship, as an old saying put it. Who would teach them? What stories would they grow up believing? And what kind of world would they build from the ashes of the old? The more I uncovered, the more I felt the weight of a forgotten tragedy pressing down on me. It was a history buried beneath layers of ice, smoke, and silence. A story too terrible to tell, yet too important to forget. And as the shadows lengthened outside my window, I realized that the mystery was far from over. Somewhere, hidden in those empty cities, was a secret waiting to be uncovered. One that could change everything we thought we knew about that frozen time. But was I ready to face what lay beneath the surface? The more I delved into those frozen cities, the more I felt like I was chasing ghosts, both literal and figurative. One evening, as the rain tapped rhythmically against my study window, I stumbled upon a curious detail tucked away in an old estate ledger from Norwich. It was a list of properties marked ready for immediate occupancy, dated precisely during the years when the cities were supposedly abandoned. What struck me was the name repeatedly appearing as the overseer of these resettlement efforts, a man named Samuel Crawford, not a politician or a high-ranking official, but someone who seemed to have been the boots-on-the-ground coordinator, the face of the restoration. I pictured Samuel as a tall, lean figure in a worn leather coat, his sleeves rolled up, hands stained with soot and ink. His face was sharp, with piercing blue eyes that didn't miss a thing, and a jaw set so tight it looked like it was carved from granite. He wasn't the kind of man to accept stories or excuses. Samuel was a man who believed in order, strict, ruthless order. Digging deeper, I found fragments of letters he had written to the government, reports filled with coded phrases, population stabilization, controlled reintegration, and ominously, containment measures. The more I read, the clearer it became. Samuel wasn't just rebuilding cities, he was managing something far more complex, something that involved controlling who came back and who was left behind. I imagined him pacing the empty streets of Norwich at dawn, the mist curling around his polished boots, eyes scanning the silent buildings with a mixture of hope and dread. Somewhere deep inside, he must have known the cities were not just empty. They were tainted by the memories and horrors left behind. One letter hinted at a clandestine project, something called the Renewal Initiative. The details were frustratingly vague, but the implication was chilling. This wasn't just about rebuilding houses and laying cobblestones. It was about reshaping society itself, starting from the ground up. I pictured Samuel overseeing a squad of workers, their faces grim beneath soot-streaked caps as they scrubbed walls and replaced windows. But behind the freshly painted facades, what ghosts lurked? What secrets were swept under the rug along with the dust? And then there was Eleanor, the woman from that cracked window, a name whispered in a few scattered journals as a reluctant witness, someone who had refused to leave her home, insisting on guarding a secret too dangerous to share. Her description was haunting, a slim figure draped in a dark wool dress that hugged her form with quiet elegance, a silver locket always resting against her chest, and eyes that burned with a fierce intelligence. She was said to move through the empty streets like a shadow, a silent sentinel in a city that had forgotten its soul. Had Eleanor been part of Samuel's renewal, or was she the last remnant of the old world, a keeper of truths that others wanted buried? I found myself drawn to their stories, the rigid, determined man trying to impose order on chaos, and the mysterious woman clinging to the fragile threads of memory. They were two sides of the same coin, locked in a silent struggle for the soul of a city that no longer seemed to belong to anyone. And as I pieced together their lives from fragments and faded words, I realized that somewhere in this tangled web lay the key to understanding what really happened during those lost years. But unraveling it would mean stepping into the shadows those cities had cast long ago and facing the darkness that had swallowed them whole. I found a faded map tucked inside a brittle folder, marked with red ink lines dividing the city into sectors. Some were annotated with words like restricted, sanitized, and quarantine. I imagined these zones as ghostly prison blocks, cordoned off with wooden barricades and guarded by watchmen armed with muskets and grim determination. The cries of those trapped inside, muffled by layers of silence and snow. And then Eleanor returned to my thoughts, the woman with the silver locket, moving like a shadow in a city that had forgotten its own heartbeat. A letter from an unknown correspondent hinted she was a courier of forbidden knowledge, someone who knew too much about what had truly happened during the darkness. I pictured her slipping through narrow alleys, her dark dress brushing cobblestones slick with frost. The faint clink of her locket was the only sound, a small silver beacon in the cold night. Was she trying to warn others, or protect a secret that could shatter the fragile new order Samuel was building? The more I learned, the more it seemed the deserted cities were not just empty. They were battlegrounds for control over memory, truth, and survival. I came across an old, almost illegible diary entry from a man named Henry, a watchman tasked with patrolling the quarantine zones. He wrote of strange figures moving in the shadows, whispers of rebellion, and a mysterious woman who appeared and disappeared like a ghost. Could this have been Eleanor? Was she a symbol of resistance, or a tragic figure caught in the crossfire? The night stretched on, and I felt an unbearable tension tightening in my chest. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was darker than I ever imagined. A city frozen in time, divided by invisible walls. A man trying to control chaos with iron will. A woman bearing the weight of forbidden secrets. And in the silence, the lingering question, what truly happened to the people who vanished? Were they victims, prisoners, or something else entirely? And then, as if the city itself was holding its breath, I found a cryptic note scribbled in the margin of a forgotten ledger. The renewal is incomplete. The final key lies beneath the silent tower. Beneath the silent tower. What tower? And what key? The mystery deepened, pulling me ever further into the shadows of a city that refused to let its secrets go. I couldn't shake the phrase from my mind. The renewal is incomplete. The final key lies beneath the silent tower. It sounded like something out of a Gothic novel, but I had a sinking feeling it was the most important clue yet. I began scouring maps of these old cities, focusing on any towers that had stood silent through the years. In Norwich, there was the infamous Bell Tower, its spire piercing the sky like a needle, long abandoned and shrouded in local legends. Some said it had been a watchtower, others whispered of a secret vault hidden beneath its foundations. I pictured that tower standing tall and brooding against a slate-gray sky, its weathered stones stained with centuries of rain. Ivy clung to its sides like grasping fingers, and the iron gate at its base creaked on rusted hinges. Inside, the darkness would be thick enough to swallow a man whole, broken only by the faint glimmer of moonlight filtering through narrow slits. The thought of exploring it sent a thrill mixed with dread through me. What if the final key was literal, a hidden safe, a chest filled with documents, or something darker? Or maybe it was metaphorical, a revelation about what really happened during those frozen years. I imagined Eleanor again, slipping through the city's deserted streets, her silver locket catching the light as she made her way toward the tower under cover of night. Was she the guardian of the secret, or the key itself? Driven by a mix of curiosity and unease, I decided I had to see for myself. I booked a trip to Norwich, telling myself it was just a historical investigation. But deep down, I knew I was chasing shadows. Arriving in Norwich, the air was sharp with early autumn chill. The city seemed peaceful, typical of a place that had weathered centuries of change. But as I wandered the narrow lanes toward the bell tower, I felt the weight of history pressing down, a silent warning not to dig too deep. The tower stood just as I had imagined, silent imposing, a relic of a forgotten time. The iron gate groaned as I pushed it open, revealing a stone staircase winding downward into darkness. The air was damp, smelling of earth and forgotten memories. With only a flashlight and my racing heart for company, I descended into the shadows beneath the tower. Every step echoed like a heartbeat in the silence, and I could swear I heard whispers brushing past the walls, voices from a past that refused to stay buried. At the bottom I found a heavy wooden door, its surface scarred and swollen with age. The lock was rusted but intact. I tried the handle. It gave way with a reluctant creak. Inside was a small chamber filled with dust-covered crates, faded documents, and relics that seemed to hum with untold stories. And there, resting on a cracked wooden table, lay a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed but preserved. Hands trembling, I opened it. The first entry was dated just months after the Great Freeze, penned in elegant script by none other than Samuel Crawford himself. The words inside promised answers, secrets that could unravel the carefully constructed myth of the renewal. But as I read further, a chilling realization settled over me. Some truths were meant to stay buried, and beneath the silent tower, in that forgotten chamber, I had just uncovered the key to a mystery that could change everything. But as the candlelight flickered and shadows danced on the walls, I knew one thing for certain. My discovery would not go unnoticed. Someone or something was still watching. The journal detailed strange experiments, attempts to understand and combat the shadow. Samuel mentioned containment chambers, purification fires, and a final safeguard hidden beneath the silent tower, the very place I was standing. My heart pounded as I flipped to the last entries. Samuel confessed doubt, fear, and the crushing loneliness of his task. He hinted at a betrayal, someone within the renewal who sought to exploit the chaos for their own gain. And then, the final chilling note. If you find this, beware, the shadow still lingers. The renewal is incomplete. Trust no one. Suddenly, the silence in the chamber felt suffocating. The shadows on the walls seemed to twist and flicker, as if alive. I realized I wasn't alone. A faint creak echoed from the staircase above, followed by the soft shuffle of footsteps. My pulse quickened. Had I been followed? Or was this some trick of the tower itself? I grabbed the journal and slipped it into my coat, heart hammering. I had come seeking answers but found a darkness that refused to be buried. I edged toward the stairs, every sense alert. The footsteps grew closer, slow, deliberate. As I reached the top, a voice whispered from the shadows, cold and low. Some stones are better left unturned. I spun around, but the corridor was empty. Was it a warning, a hallucination, or had the shadow Samuel wrote of somehow survived, lurking still in the bones of the city? One thing was clear, my discovery had awakened something. And now, I was part of a story much bigger and far more dangerous than I ever imagined. The chill in the air thickened as I stepped out of the tower, clutching Samuel's journal like a lifeline. The streets of Norwich felt strangely unfamiliar, as if the city itself had shifted during my descent into those forgotten depths. The fog curled around lampposts, swallowing the gaslight's glow, turning familiar corners into shadows that whispered warnings. I couldn't shake the voice, the cold whisper that had brushed past me like a ghost. Some stones are better left unturned. It echoed in my mind, a sinister refrain that tangled with the dread curling in my gut. That night, in a small, creaky inn on Elm Hill, I pored over the journal's pages by candlelight. Samuel's words painted a grim tableau. The shadow was no mere metaphor, but a creeping madness that infected not just minds, but the very essence of the city. It thrived on fear, despair, and isolation, the perfect prey in those frozen years. The renewal initiative had been desperate, resorting to brutal measures, quarantine, forced evacuations, even executions. But the shadow clung on, mutating, hiding in the cracks of stone and memory. And worst of all, Samuel hinted that the shadow wasn't just an external threat. It had taken root inside the very people charged with fighting it. I turned the pages to find a map crudely sketched in the margins, marking several hot zones scattered across the city, places where the shadow's influence was strongest. One name stood out, The old foundry, a derelict factory at the edge of town, long abandoned but whispered about in local legends as a place where the dead still speak. Curiosity and dread warred within me, but I knew I had to see it for myself. The next morning, under a leaden sky, I made my way to the old foundry. Its rusted gates groaned as I pushed them open, revealing a cavernous building swallowed by shadows and graffiti. Inside, the air was thick with decay and something else, an almost tangible weight, like the building itself was holding its breath. As I stepped deeper, the silence was broken only by the drip of water echoing through the vast space. Eleanor, its sudden chill swept through the foundry, and the flickering beam of my flashlight danced wildly across the walls. In the shadows, I thought I saw movement, shapes shifting just beyond the edge of vision. "Why are you here?" Eleanor asked, her voice steady but eyes wary. "To find the truth," I said, voice barely steady, "to bring light to what's been hidden." She studied me a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then you must be ready to face what lies beneath the silence." The cities weren't just emptied by cold and famine. They were abandoned to the shadow's hunger, and some never left. From the darkness, a low guttural sound rose, a whispering chorus of voices echoing through the hollow spaces. The air grew heavy, suffocating. I realized then that the shadow wasn't just a phantom, it was a presence, alive and watching. Eleanor reached into her dress and pulled out the silver locket. She opened it to reveal a tiny faded photograph, an image of a family, smiling and warm, frozen in happier times. "This is why I stayed," she said. "To remember, to hold on to what the shadow tries to steal. But the longer I do, the harder it becomes." Suddenly, a piercing scream shattered the silence, ricocheting off the broken walls. The shadows surged, swirling like smoke, and I felt a cold breath on my neck, as if the city itself was whispering its warning. I stumbled back, heart racing, as Eleanor grabbed my arm. "The shadow is waking," she said urgently. "It knows you're here."